Northeastern Wisconsin in the late 19th century was a landscape shaped more by forests than by towns. The region between Green Bay and the Michigan border was dominated by dense stands of white pine, hemlock, and hardwoods that stretched for miles without interruption. Rivers cut through the trees in slow, dark channels, carrying logs downstream toward sawmills along the bay. The Peshtigo River was one of these waterways. It moved steadily southward, widening as it approached the small settlement that bore its name. Peshtigo, in 1871, was not an isolated outpost, but it was not a developed town in any modern sense. It was a frontier community built to support logging. Wooden buildings stood close together. Roads were unpaved. Rail lines extended into the forest to extract timber, then stopped abruptly. Beyond them, there were only footpaths and clearings where trees had recently been cut. The land was dry that year. Summer had passed with little rain. Streams ran lower than usual. The forest floor was covered with needles, bark, and branches left behind by logging crews. These conditions were not unusual enough to draw attention. Fire was part of daily life in the region. Small burns were used to clear land. Smoke was a common sight in the distance. Early October arrived with cooler air. Leaves began to turn. Nights lengthened. People continued their routines. Families prepared meals. Laborers worked the mills and rail lines. The forest stood still around them, vast and quiet, offering no immediate sign that it was about to change. At the edge of town, the river moved without disturbance. It reflected the sky and carried debris from upstream. For those who lived along its banks, it was a working river, not a refuge. At that moment, there was no reason to see it otherwise. By 1871, Peshtigo had become one of the most active lumbering centers in Wisconsin. The surrounding forests supplied timber to sawmills that operated along the riverbanks, producing lumber for rapidly growing cities across the Midwest. This industry shaped nearly every aspect of life in the area. Work schedules followed daylight and weather. Housing was built quickly and often temporarily, with little separation between industrial and residential spaces. The population of Peshtigo and its nearby settlements consisted largely of immigrants and first-generation Americans. Many had arrived from Germany, Scandinavia, Ireland, and Eastern Europe, drawn by the promise of steady work. Logging camps and mill jobs required strength more than formal training. Men felled trees in the forest or worked long hours feeding logs into saws. Women managed households, took in boarders, and, in some cases, worked in local businesses. Children contributed where they could, often from a young age. Life was structured around labor and necessity. Buildings were made almost entirely of wood, including homes, churches, barns, and schools. Fireplaces and stoves were used for cooking and heat. Kerosene lamps provided light after sunset. Wells supplied water, though not every household had one. The river served as transportation, waste disposal, and power source. Despite the physical demands, the community was stable. Churches and social gatherings offered routine and familiarity. People expected hardship, but not sudden catastrophe. Forest fires occurred regularly in the region, usually small and manageable. They burned brush or cleared unused land and were allowed to run their course unless they threatened a structure. By early October, logging operations were still active. Timber was easier to move before winter froze the ground completely. Smoke from distant burns drifted through the air on many days, and residents had grown accustomed to it. There was no organized fire service capable of responding to large blazes. Responsibility for safety rested with individuals and neighbors. This was the setting in which the people of Peshtigo lived, productive, exposed, and reliant on routine. The forest provided work and materials. It also surrounded every settlement, close enough that its conditions directly shaped daily life. When changes occurred in that environment, they would affect everyone at once. On October 8, 1871, weather conditions across northeastern Wisconsin shifted quietly but decisively. The summer had been unusually dry. Weeks had passed with little rainfall. Forest floors were layered with dry needles, leaves, and logging debris. Small fires burned throughout the region, many set deliberately to clear land or dispose of brush. Others smoldered unattended after campfires or industrial work. That afternoon, temperatures dropped slightly, and the air became unsettled. A cold front moved in from the west. Winds increased as the day progressed, though there was nothing immediately alarming about it. Smoke hung low, blurring the sky into a dull haze. This had become common enough that most people took little notice. As evening approached, the wind strengthened further and began to shift direction. Separate fires that had been scattered across miles of forest were pushed toward one another. Embers lifted into the air and traveled long distances. New fires ignited ahead of the main burn lines, often beyond rivers or clearings that might otherwise have slowed them. Sometime after nightfall, the fires converged. What followed was not a single advancing wall of flame, but a rapidly moving firestorm. Wind speeds are estimated to have exceeded hurricane force in places, though exact measurements were not recorded. The fire created its own weather. Superheated air rose quickly, pulling oxygen inward from all sides. This intensified combustion and drove the flames forward at a speed few people had ever witnessed. Entire settlements were overtaken in minutes. In Peshtigo, residents became aware of danger almost simultaneously. Smoke thickened, visibility dropped, and the sound of wind grew louder. Burning debris began to fall from the sky. Wooden structures ignited almost as soon as embers landed on them. Roads disappeared in the darkness. Familiar landmarks were lost. At this point, escape routes narrowed sharply. The river remained, but reaching it required moving through heat, smoke, and collapsing buildings. Some people attempted to flee on foot. Others sought shelter where they were. Decisions were made quickly, often without full information. Once the firestorm reached the town, isolation was complete. There was no outside assistance and no possibility of coordinated response. Survival depended entirely on immediate choices, proximity to water or open ground, and endurance under extreme conditions. By late evening, Peshtigo and surrounding communities were largely destroyed. Thousands of acres burned in a single night. The fire would not fully subside until early morning, when winds weakened and fuel was exhausted. What remained afterward was silence, ash, and a small number of people who had endured the night by circumstance rather than design. As the firestorm moved through Peshtigo, ordinary patterns of survival no longer applied. The speed of the flames and the force of the wind made organized escape impossible. What followed was a series of improvised responses shaped by geography, chance, and physical endurance. Many survivors moved toward the Peshtigo River. Water offered partial protection from heat and flying embers, though it was not a refuge without risk. The air above the river became thick with smoke, making breathing difficult. Some people submerged themselves repeatedly to avoid burns. Others clung to logs, boats, or debris to stay afloat for hours. The cold water slowed the spread of fire across the surface, but introduced exhaustion and hypothermia. Those who could not reach the river sought shelter in wells, cellars, or open fields. Wells were narrow and deep, sometimes filled with smoke rather than water. People lowered themselves into them to escape the flames, pressing against damp walls as heat passed overhead. Some survived. Others were overcome by smoke or trapped when debris collapsed above them. In open areas, survival depended on distance from fuel. Fields that had already been cleared or burned earlier offered limited safety. Individuals lay flat against the ground, covering their faces, while fire moved past them. Clothing ignited easily. Burns were common, even among those who survived. The firestorm did not behave predictably. Flames moved in multiple directions at once. Firebrands fell far ahead of the main burn, igniting new structures without warning. Heat intensified suddenly, then receded, then returned. Sound was constant: wind, falling timber, collapsing roofs, making communication impossible. Time lost meaning during the night. There were no clear markers between minutes and hours. Survival required sustained effort rather than a single decisive action. People adjusted continuously, moving when heat increased, staying still when movement became impossible, choosing between smoke and flame. By early morning, the wind began to weaken. The fire consumed most available fuel and gradually lost intensity. When daylight came, it revealed a landscape altered beyond recognition. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Roads were erased. Trees stood blackened and stripped. Those who emerged from the river, wells, or open ground did so cautiously. Many were injured. Burns ranged from mild to severe. Smoke inhalation had left some unable to stand or speak clearly. Families searched for one another among ruins, often without success. Survival during the fire had been random and uneven. Proximity to water, a momentary shelter, or a brief change in wind direction often determined who lived and who did not. There had been no strategy capable of guaranteeing safety, only endurance through conditions that exceeded normal human experience. When the fire finally subsided, the scale of destruction became apparent only gradually. The morning light revealed a flattened town where few structures remained intact. Wooden buildings had been reduced to ash. Brick chimneys stood alone without walls. Rail lines were twisted and buried beneath debris. The forest surrounding Peshtigo was burned through for miles in every direction, leaving only scorched ground and standing trunks stripped of branches. The number of dead was impossible to determine immediately. Many bodies had been burned beyond recognition. Others were never found. Estimates varied, but later counts placed the death toll at more than 1,100 people, making it the deadliest wildfire in United States history. Entire families were lost. In some cases, only one member survived. In others, no one did. Survivors faced injuries that could not be treated easily. Burns were common and often severe. Medical care in the region was limited, and local facilities had been destroyed. Makeshift shelters were established from what little material remained. Those with intact clothing shared it. Food was scarce. Wells were contaminated by ash and debris. The river, which had saved many lives, now carried the remains of buildings and livestock. Psychological strain became evident in the days that followed. Survivors struggled to account for missing relatives. Identification of the dead was often impossible. Burial was hurried, sometimes communal, due to health concerns and lack of resources. The absence of ceremony reflected necessity rather than indifference. Communication with the outside world was slow. Rail lines were damaged. Telegraph lines were down. News of the disaster spread unevenly, overshadowed in national attention by the Great Chicago Fire, which had occurred the same night. Relief arrived, but not immediately, and not in sufficient quantity at first. Time blurred for those who remained. Days were marked by recovery of bodies, care for the injured, and attempts to secure basic needs. The physical environment offered few signs of life. The forest that had supported the logging economy was gone. Livelihoods disappeared, along with homes. For survivors, endurance did not end with the fire itself. Survival extended into a prolonged period of uncertainty, loss, and physical recovery. The disaster altered the structure of the community permanently. Peshtigo would be rebuilt, but it would never fully resemble what had existed before. In the days following the fire, the relief began to reach Peshtigo and the surrounding region. Aid arrived from neighboring towns, rail lines that remained intact, and state authorities who mobilized resources despite the remote location. Food, blankets, and medical supplies were brought in by wagon and rail, though the scale of the disaster meant that assistance was limited and unevenly distributed. Survivors organized themselves as best they could. Temporary shelters were constructed from remaining timbers, canvas, or any salvageable material. Wells and the river became central not only for survival, but also as points around which makeshift communities gathered. People tended to the injured, shared food, and attempted to reconnect with family members. Medical attention focused on immediate needs. Burns were dressed using the resources available, often home remedies, or what could be salvaged from nearby towns. Smoke inhalation, dehydration, and exhaustion required attention, though many conditions could not be fully treated. Survivors waited for more substantial aid while attempting to maintain some routine. The process of locating and identifying the dead continued for weeks. Many bodies were buried in mass graves or marked hastily with makeshift identifiers. Communities attempted to record names and tally losses, though certainty was rarely achieved. The scale of death, combined with the physical devastation, made this a slow and somber task. Food scarcity remained a pressing concern. Stores had been destroyed, and livestock were lost in the fire. Relief supplies provided short-term sustenance, but survivors were forced to rely on wild foods, eat preserved goods from undamaged areas, and rationing. Discipline in consumption became essential to ensure survival until aid could be reliably delivered. Throughout this period, the environment remained changed. The forests that once dominated the area were blackened and bare. Rivers carried ash and debris downstream. Roads and rail lines were partially blocked. The landscape reflected both the immediate violence of the fire and the slow process of recovery that would continue for months. Despite the scale of loss, the community's survival was quiet and practical. There was no public celebration. Assistance arrived in a measured, procedural manner. Those who had endured the fire adapted to the new circumstances, focusing on shelter, nourishment, and care for the injured. Weeks after the fire, Peshtigo remained a place of quiet struggle. Yet survivors faced the physical aftermath of burns, smoke exposure, and injuries that had gone untreated during the initial chaos. Many were weakened by dehydration, malnutrition, and fatigue. The destruction of homes and infrastructure compounded the challenge. There was little to shield people from the elements, and temperatures were already dropping as autumn progressed toward winter. Rebuilding was slow. Salvageable materials were gathered from debris, and temporary shelters were erected. The landscape itself, blackened, open, and littered with ash, provided no familiar reference points. Movement across the town was difficult. Roads were blocked, bridges destroyed, and landmarks erased. Navigation required caution and local knowledge that had been rendered unreliable. The psychological strain persisted. The survivors confronted the absence of neighbors, friends, and family. Grief was compounded by the inability to identify many of the dead. Routine became an anchor, collecting firewood, purifying water, securing food, but the monotony also highlighted the losses endured. Children, in particular, were affected by both the trauma and the abrupt changes to their daily lives. Aid continued to arrive from nearby communities and state authorities, but it could not replace what had been lost. Food, clothing, and medical supplies were rationed. Some survivors relocated temporarily to relatives or other towns. Others remained, determined to reclaim the land and maintain what was left of the settlement. Work resumed in limited fashion, clearing debris, rebuilding homes, and preparing for the winter. The forest, which had been a source of work and sustenance, now appeared as a reminder of the fire's force. Charred trees stood like sentinels over the ash-covered ground. Rivers ran darker with soot and debris. Even as natural processes resumed, the scars of the disaster remained visible, tangible, and inescapable. Peshtigo's endurance was quiet. Life continued without ceremony. The daily effort of survival and reconstruction defined existence more than any external recognition. The fire had claimed the lives of many, but those who remained carried forward, their survival a testimony to resilience in the face of unrelenting environmental and human-imposed hazards. As weeks turned into months, Peshtigo began the slow process of stabilization. Rail lines were cleared of debris where possible, and supply routes reopened. Yet merchants and townspeople established provisional stores, using salvaged goods, donations, and shipments from surrounding communities. Food, clothing, and tools became available in small quantities, allowing survivors to plan beyond the immediate need for sustenance. Reconstruction focused first on essentials. Homes were rebuilt with whatever material could be salvaged, often in simpler forms than before. Churches and public buildings were repaired when possible, providing spaces for shelter and community gatherings. Wells and cisterns were restored, and small gardens were planted to supplement meager supplies. The community adapted to the landscape, altered by fire. Burned forests were cleared for new fields. Fallen timber was used in reconstruction or as firewood. Roads and paths were reopened gradually. So while these efforts restored some order, the memory of the disaster remained present in every aspect of life. Survivors moved carefully through the charred terrain, mindful of lingering hazards such as weakened structures or hidden embers. The process of recovery was also social. Neighbors assisted one another with labor, shared food, and tended to the sick and injured. Families sought out missing members and accounted for losses as best they could. The collective experience of the fire reshaped social networks, reinforcing bonds among survivors while emphasizing the fragility of life in the frontier environment. Over time, the focus shifted from mere survival to long-term planning. Livelihoods were restored incrementally. Logging resumed where forests were recoverable. Trade and commerce returned, though on a reduced scale. The town of Peshtigo persisted, its geography and human settlement reshaped by fire but not eliminated. The quiet persistence of the survivors defined this phase. There was no public celebration, marking the passage through disaster. Recovery was measured in steps of practical accomplishment, rebuilding a home, securing a well, tending to the injured, and preparing for the next winter. Survival had required endurance during the fire itself. It now required endurance across months of recovery in a changed and fragile environment. Decades later, the Great Fire of Peshtigo remained a singular event in American history, notable for its scale and suddenness, yet largely overshadowed in public memory. Thousands had perished in a single night, and thousands more had endured injuries, trauma, and the prolonged challenge of rebuilding. And the survivors carried forward a quiet resilience, reconstructing homes, restoring livelihoods, and sustaining their families in a landscape that had been irrevocably altered. The town itself persisted, though its original form was lost. Streets, buildings, and forests had been replaced or reshaped. The fire changed both the physical environment and the social fabric of the community. What remained was a settlement defined as much by absence as by reconstruction, by the lives preserved as much as by those lost. The scorched land became a testament to the dangers of frontier life and the unpredictable power of natural forces when combined with human activity. Historical records of the fire provide a factual account of survival rather than narrative drama. Names of the dead and surviving families appear in census records, newspaper accounts, and later, historical analyses. The event offers a study in human endurance under conditions of extreme heat, disorientation, and isolation, as well as a reminder of how quickly a familiar environment can become deadly. Peshtigo's story is measured and observational. It is not a tale of triumph, nor is it sensationalized. Survival was determined by circumstance, resourcefulness, and the ability to withstand both immediate danger and the slow, grinding work of recovery. The quiet endurance of those who survived speaks to the human capacity to persist without spectacle, to continue life in the face of overwhelming loss. The land around Peshtigo has since regenerated. Forests returned in the decades after the fire, and the town remained as a modest community. The memory of 1871 endures in historical records, in mass graves and memorials, and in the measured recounting of those who lived through it. The story ends without flourish. It ends with the observation that some lives survived, some were lost, and the frontier itself remained both home and hazard.